This position is white to play in checkmate in 3. And again, I'm going to roll through this now and get to one of the most complicated positions that should be memorized when you start with the king in the opposite color corner of the bishop, and try to give you some principles along the way. But you can watch this video as many times as you need to get this pattern memorized. So this position, as I said, is white to play in checkmate in 3. If you haven't paused your video and try to solve it yourself, then again, that's a you problem, not a me problem. I'm going to move ahead. Knight f5, king g8, knight h6 check. The king moves back, and the bishop delivers the goods. Remember that in many cases, the knight is the one relocating and putting itself in a position to guard the light squares, in this case especially because we have a dark squared bishop. If it was the opposite, if we had a light squared bishop, often the knight is relocating itself to control the dark squares. So remember that first tip. The knight wants to help control the opposite color squares of the bishop. So this position is again a checkmate in 3, very common climax where the knight relocates and eventually the bishop delivers the goods. Okay, in the next position you see here, we have a checkmate in 6 moves. We've backed up the same pattern, just a few moves. And if you move forward, you see that black's last move, king to g8, is preparing to escape along the light squares. Wouldn't be the end of the world if you made a mistake and let it happen, because the king is already pretty much trapped in the corner. But the general rule that you should remember is that the king follows the knight's lead. So whenever the knight has put itself on the optimal square, usually the king is close to follow, lining itself up directly with the knight. In that case, they do work very well together, controlling the enemy king and keeping him in a cage, more or less. So this position, white plays king g6, makes a waiting move with the bishop, and then takes away the square, forcing him into the corner. After king to h8, do you recognize this position? It's the same one we just did, right? 1, 2, 3. Check that out. From the position here after the move king to g6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now what we've done is simply back it up only one move further. It's a pretty common setup to see the king and knight lined up in this way, with the black king preparing, hopefully, to run back to the other side of the board. In general, the best defensive strategy is to try to stay away from the same color corner as the bishop. Unfortunately, it's not really something you can consider a strategy, because it's pretty much based on whether or not your opponent messes up. If your opponent knows how to checkmate with the knight and bishop, there's no way the king can outplay the king in 2 pieces. But in this case, white starts with the move knight to g7. Again, remember, we're getting to the same pattern over and over, controlling the light squares. And after the king moves, obviously we move into the exact position with the king we highlighted on the last position. And the rest is pretty much history. The king moves back to f8. We make a waiting move with the bishop to take away the square and thus force him into the position of the corner, ending with a checkmate in 3. Note that if the king had played king h8, it doesn't make any difference, because at this point, white's pattern to coordinate his pieces into the right position is not based on anything black is doing. White can lead with the knight first, or even make a bishop move first. But after the knight moves and the bishop comes in to take away the square, earlier we were making a waiting move with the bishop with the king on f8. Here we make a bishop move now, as obviously knight h6 would be stalemate. That would be bad. And after one simple waiting move anywhere along this diagonal would work. White completes the mating pattern we've seen several times. Now what we're going to do, now that I've shown you sort of the climax mating pattern that consistently repeats itself, we're going to go to the beginning of a position that I believe every chess player should memorize. It's the one that is difficult and really challenges your knowledge of the position, because some of the patterns are very counterintuitive, meaning if you haven't seen them or practiced before, they'd be very difficult to figure out the first time. That's what that little phrase counterintuitive means. So let's back up to the beginning position and talk about a very famous, well-known pattern of the knights as they push the king to the opposite color corner. In this situation, the king would love to maintain itself in the opposite color corner of the bishop in order to avoid a forced checkmate. If white does not know the following pattern that we're about to do, it's not possible to force the checkmate to the black king. You have to understand how to coordinate your pieces and push him from one side of the board to the other. There's a 3-step process that I sort of invented and I use with my students. It rhymes, and I know that sounds silly, but I think when things rhyme and it's kind of fun to remember, it makes it easier. First thing we do is remember that we have to use the bishop to take away the dark squares of the king. We don't want to use our knight to control the same color squares as the bishop. That's wrong. We want to use the knight to control the opposite color squares so that they're both serving a purpose. So we make a waiting move and then take away this square from the king in order to first start the process of pushing him to the other side of the board. Now starts our three step phrase that we can use to remember how to do this. First one is the knight leads the way. The knight leads first. Whenever the king and knight are lined up, remember that the knight is the first piece to improve itself. If you move the king first, the black king would simply go right back to where it once was, immediately threaten to remain on the light squares, and white's only move to continue to make progress would be to actually just come right back with the king and admit his mistake. So after the move king to d8, we lead the way with the knight. Knight goes first. Now, again, this is why it's counterintuitive. Players who don't know this position would have a hard time allowing this to happen, because at first glance it looks like your pieces are completely uncoordinated with no pattern existing in this position, but it's not true. If the king chooses to run, which is what most players do, the king follows closely behind. Okay, so the knight leads the way, and the phrase I use with younger players is the king saves the day, meaning that he follows the knight. He doesn't let the knight do the job on its own. So after the knight leads, the king is always the next piece to move. The king is always the next piece to follow. And when he runs away, our knight takes a square that actually, again, this pattern seems very uncoordinated, but the knight is working to guard light squares so that the bishop can come all the way back and complete the box. Okay? The bishop delivers the goods. That's the final step. So the knight leads the way, the king saves the day, and the bishop delivers the goods. Just a fun way to remember. The bishop is always there in the end to complete the trap. Okay? Now, we're going to back up before we look at this again and show you what would happen on some of the more obvious moves. After the knight leads the way, and if the king was to repeat, we would have no problem. The knight would simply check, the king would save the day, and when he tried to go back, you notice this is actually the exact same situation we had with the king and knight here. The bishop would check, take the square, and we could just rinse and repeat this thing like shampoo and walk the king over, and notice that without making any run, if he doesn't make any sort of run to try to escape, then our process is very simple. And if you recognize this position, it's the one we first started with, checkmate and uno, dos, tres. So again, just memorize that this initial position with the king and knight lined up and the knight guarding the light squares is very easy. And if the king attempts to remain on the back rank the entire time, our process is very simple. Knight leads the way, we take away the square, the king saves the day, staying with the knight, and when he tries to stay on the dark squares, the bishop comes in and cleans up. Again, this process shouldn't be, this is the easiest one to recognize and remember, because black is not making any direct challenge of white's approach. So again, the hardest thing you learn is the one we first did here, where the king actually tries to make an attempt to run away with the move king d8. And the key thing to remember here is that the step process I gave, as counterintuitive as it looks, to move the king in this position when it seems like all your pieces are completely uncoordinated, that's exactly what you need to do. The knight led the way, the king saves the day, preparing to protect the square so that the knight might come in and guard light squares. And if the king went back, we would be exactly in the same pattern we saw earlier, where the knight comes in to guard this square, the king would eventually line up with the knight, and the bishop would simply repeat the process of pushing the king over. So what we saw was that the king tries to run. Regardless of what he does, we're bringing the knight into this square, where it guards the critical escape routes. And the most counterintuitive thing to remember is this position here. Take a good look at this position here and try to tattoo it on your eyelid or something so you see it every time you close your eyes. Really memorize this one, okay? And take it home, because it's the one that if you can remember that the knight and bishop will coordinate themselves well, as long as the knight is on the same color square as the bishop, therefore guarding opposite color squares. If you can remember this pattern, then you can figure it out over the board. And now the process of completing it by simply getting him into the corner is not hard. He moves the king. We bring the bishop up. Notice how well the knight and bishop work together. He tries to escape back. We ignore it, lining up the king and knight, as we know is the right thing to do. And here we can simply come back, taking away this square. Notice how the most important thing to do is to keep the king and knight in optimal coordination and together, because the bishop, can be left behind like it was on a7, coming all the way back to e3 to guard critical squares. Here the bishop is left behind, but can quickly guard a critical square when need be. The bishop is a much easier piece to bring in to, like I said, deliver the goods and clean up the position, whereas the knight and king really need to stay together, and that constantly, leading the way with the knight and then relining the king up with it is a really important pattern to remember. So let's see how we finish this one off. We'll bring the bishop in. knight leads the way, king saves the day. If he goes king h7 or king f8, in either case we're bringing the knight to g7. In this case, we would bring the knight to g7. Both cases were guarding critical squares. The bishop would come in. If the king had gone to e8, by the way, or sorry, f8, we would have lined up the king and the bishop would have come in this way, repeating the position we actually first started with an eventual obvious checkmate. So we'll stick with this one, king h7, since we haven't done that way yet. Knight g7, bishop comes back, line up the king, and rather than the first position where we saw the knight relocate to h6, here, because the position of the king is different, we would simply bring the knight to f8, so that the diagonal remains clear for the bishop to deliver the goods. Take a good look at that again. Again, even though it looks different, it's the same checkmate in 3. Knight moves, enters in, bishop delivers the goods. Okay, well that has been a quick version of how to checkmate with a knight and bishop, and hopefully that's some valuable material for you guys here on Chess.com's YouTube channel, and hopefully we'll see you on the main site. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.